Hey everybody, it's Boo-Ray Perry, and today I want to talk about a camera that is very important in the history of photography, a camera that is near and dear to my heart, and it's the Pentax K1000. So why is this an important camera in the history of photography? It's possible that you've never even heard of the Pentax K1000. So let's talk about this camera for just a few minutes and maybe expand our knowledge a little bit about old school film. If you're younger and you've only ever shot digital, then this will be a fun little thing for you. Just stick with me because you're gonna enjoy this. I promise you're gonna like it. So the Pentax K1000 first came out in 1976, the bicentennial year for us here in the States, and it ran for 21 years. Yeah. 1997 was when this camera came out of production, and they updated it a little bit over the years, but think about that for a minute. 21 years. If you buy a camera now, if you buy it the right when it comes off the factory, brand new, they've just released that version. 3 years, maybe 4 years later, there's going to be a new version, right? You're going to get the XT4, the XT5, so forth and so on. But the Pentax K1000, they released some other versions of it that had a few little things, but the camera itself essentially stayed unchanged for 21 years. Why is that? Why did this camera survive for so long? It had a lot of drawbacks. I mean, a lot of drawbacks. For starters, there was nothing in the viewfinder for you to look at except for the picture. Well, there was one thing, and it was the needle. Right. That's where when we talk about the needle, when we talk about exposure and centering the needle, we're talking about the K1000. Well, other cameras too, but for me, the K1000, because that's all that there was inside the viewfinder was an exposure needle. That's it. Just a light meter. You get that needle in the middle, you know your exposure is right. Now, what about your shutter speed? What about your aperture? What about your ISO? Yeah, if you want to find out what your shutter speed and your aperture and your ISO are on this camera, you're going to have to look at the lens. You're going to have to look here at your shutter speed dial. You know, your ISO is going to be preset when you put the camera in, so you're never going to be allowed to mess with the ISO at all anyway. You could not see it by looking through the camera. You had to come back out here to see exactly what those numbers were. When you were inside the viewfinder, you were only seeing your scene and the light meter needle. That was it. It also just didn't have a whole lot of features on it. Like, it didn't have a self-timer. like a self-timer is pretty much, it's de rigueur. Yeah, everybody's got a self-timer on their camera. Not the Pentax K1000. There were other cameras made at that time that had depth of field indicators and stuff like that in them. Nope. Not the Pentax K1000. They stripped this camera down to its bare bones. And they sold 3 million of them. 3 million of them over a 21-year period. So, if this was so bare bones, if it was so minimal, how is it that it stayed in production for so long and it sold so many copies? Well, I'm going to tell you. Almost everything they took out of this camera was also a benefit in some way. For starters, the fact that it only had a light meter and nothing else in it meant that it only needed one little battery, a D76 battery, that was there to run the light meter. If the battery was dead, the camera would still operate. Right. You could still use the camera. Now, the light meter wouldn't be working, so you'd have to guess your light or have a separate light meter, but the camera would still work. And that's just something that doesn't happen today. If you don't have a battery in your camera's not going to work. But this camera, full mechanical, would work without a battery in it. Another thing that was interesting about it was there was no off-on switch. If you look at the camera, there's no switch because it was always on. The only way you could turn it off was to put a lens cap on the front. If you put a lens cap on the front, that would stop the light meter from actually measuring any light, and so it wouldn't drain the battery. But if you left your lens cap off the camera, then the battery would actually drain. And I'm not sure that I actually knew that when I was using this camera in high school. I just found that out today. It's pretty funny that, the lens cap was your off-on switch. If you took the lens cap off, the camera was on, ready to go. No time waiting for it to start up. It was always ready to go. I think that's kind of a pretty cool feature. Another thing about this camera that made it so great was that it was all metal construction. I guess a lot of cameras were all metal construction, but this was a camera I used in high school, and then eventually I got a Pentax ME. I think an ME Super maybe was my first that I personally owned camera. But even then, when I got the ME, it just didn't feel as sturdy as this camera. I worked at a department store when I was 16 years old called Montgomery Ward's. Some of you who are older will remember Montgomery Ward's, and if you don't know what Montgomery Ward's is, Montgomery Ward's was a department store, just like Sears or J.C. Penney, which are gone now as well. But Montgomery Ward's just left quicker, sooner than they did. So I worked in the housewares department. So it's all women. You know, it was all girls that were hired in the housewares department, and they're selling pots and pans and toaster ovens, and so am I. But in the housewares department was also the camera counter, and that's why I was brought in there, because the person who ran the housewares department said no one knows anything about cameras, and they do drop off film there and have it developed and pick up your film there. But they needed someone who knew something about cameras, and I was a photographer in high school, so I got hired to work the camera counter, and I sold a bunch of these cameras. And one of the things that I used to tell people whenever I would be pitching this camera was that you could beat this camera against a tree and you wouldn't break it. And it's true. I wish that I could convey to you just how heavy and sturdy this camera is in your hand. It is just rock solid. It is a rock solid piece of all metal brick. You cannot hurt this camera. Here's another thing I love about this camera. You see this little, I don't know if you can see it, but right here there's a little red dot. You see that little red dot? That's an indicator to let you know that the film has been advanced and the camera is ready to fire. See, other cameras didn't have that. Other cameras, you would take a picture, and if you forgot to wind your film, you would go take another picture, and oh, I didn't wind my film. This camera, if you look down at it, you could see that little red dot, and you would know that it was ready to fire. It's a cool feature. I don't think it's really necessary because your hand is right here, and if you go to take a picture, you know, you would have to look. And in the time it took you to look to see if it was ready, you could also just flip the lever and see, you know, if it was wound. But it was a feature that other cameras at the time didn't have. But here's the thing about picking up this camera today. The shutter, I mean, the shutter is so satisfying. And I know that this is camera nerd territory. It really is. But I want to see if hopefully I can get this on the mic, if you can hear this. You hear that? It's like loading a shotgun. It's just like, cha-chonk, right? Oh, so satisfying, that sound. So perfect, just the perfect sound of a shutter. And I don't know if it's perfect to me because it's the one that I heard when I was taking pictures of football games and the Spanish teacher for her profile in the yearbook. I don't know, but it will always be to me the sound of a professional camera. So lots of features in this camera that didn't exist, and they made it for 21 years. But what you haven't really told us, Boo Ray, is why is this an important camera in the history of photography? Hang on a second. I've never said this on the camera before. But I had cancer, and as a result, I have to drink all the time. So that's why I'm always drinking on my videos. So why was it important? Well, first of all, it wasn't that expensive. It was $299, and it came with a 50mm f2 lens for $299, and it stayed around that price point the entire run of the camera. Matter of fact, I think it actually got cheaper towards the end. But the thing that makes it so important is that because it was so stripped down, because it was so solid, because you couldn't break it or destroy it, it was the camera that was used by schools all over the world. When I was in high school, we had one camera for the yearbook department. Just one. It was a Pentax K1000. There were 3 photographers, and by the time I got to high school, I probably had my own camera. No, I don't think I did. I think I got my camera the year after I was on yearbook. But at the time, we had to share the one camera. You know, we had the one camera with a big rainbow strap on it, and who's going to be shooting the football game tonight? Well, it's going to be me. Okay, I would grab the camera and a couple of rolls of film, and I would go and shoot the football game. And we had this one camera. Now think about it. This camera was shared by 3 teenage boys, and it was shared every year, year after year after year, by a bunch of teenage boys who did not care about taking care of this camera at all. And yet, year after year, it did the job, and it worked just fine because it was so rock solid. But the other thing about this camera, and one of the reasons that a lot of yearbooks and photography teachers would insist on this being the camera that was used by the school, is because it was so stripped down, you couldn't let the camera do anything for you. There was no auto mode. There was no aperture priority, no shutter priority. There was none of that. This camera only worked in full manual mode. Here's your shutter speed on the lens. Here's your aperture on the lens. Here's your shutter speed. Here's your ISO. That's it. There's nothing else for you to mess with. There's no screens. There's no dials. There's no buttons. There's no nothing. Here's the only button on the camera is this one. That's it, the shutter. And because of that, if you were using this camera, you were forced to learn how to use a camera. You could not fall back on letting the camera do the job for you. You had to learn photography. Now, that being said, I didn't learn a whole lot about photography when I used the K1000. I somehow made it all the way through high school, and I don't think I ever knew what depth of field was. Can you imagine? I'm shooting pictures for the yearbook. I don't know what depth of field is. All I knew was get the needle in the center. Drop the needle on the record. That's all I knew how to do. And so I would get that needle there any way possible. And generally what I would do is I would set the shutter speed before I even went out the door, like 60th of a second. ISO is set according to the film that's in the camera. And then I would just turn the front dial on the camera until I got the needle where I wanted it to be, not realizing and knowing that I was changing the aperture and affecting my depth of field. I don't think I ever really knew that. So it's a miracle that I became the photography genius that I am today. But I would say that people who took a photography class who used a camera like this, well, they were taught that stuff. See, we were just thrown into it. The yearbook teacher also taught French, and he had other things to worry about than teaching us important things like composition and the exposure triangle. So we just had to get it done any way that we could. But if you took a photography class, of course, they were going to teach you all that, and you had to learn it using this camera. There was no other choice but to learn it using this camera, and it's 21-year run. I'm going to segue right into a pitch real quick now that I'm talking about that. If you want to learn more about photography, you need to go check out my channel. Go to BooRayPerry.com, and I will put a link down in the description. Go to my website, BooRayPerry.com, and see everything that I've got there. I've got a couple of free ebooks for you and guides to help you get started. I've got a fantastic 75-page ebook guide on natural light photography, which is the first thing that you need to learn how to do if you're learning how to be a photographer, or it's the first thing you need to learn how to do better if you already consider yourself a photographer. And there will be a code down in the description for 50% off on that book, so be sure and go check it out. All right, that's it. That is the Pentax K1000. This is a camera that is near and dear to my heart, and I'll tell you a quick story how I got this particular model right here. I was going to speak at a convention at Imaging USA one year, and I'm in the airport, and I had just come out of the bathroom. I got off the plane, I came out of the bathroom, and a guy was standing there. And he walked up to me and he said, "Excuse me, are you Ray Perry?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "I listen to your podcast and I'm a big fan." I said, "Well, thank you very much." And he said, "You talked about the Pentax K1000 and how much you liked it and how much it meant to you. And so I thought you might like to have this." And he took this camera out of his bag and he handed it to me. He had gone, I don't know, and found one on eBay somewhere. And he said, "I don't even know if it works." Yeah, it works. You know why? It'll always work. Because it's a Pentax K1000. It is one of the most thoughtful and nicest gifts I have ever been given by a complete stranger who is now a good friend of mine, of course, in my life. And that's how I got this camera. And you'll notice it's always sitting back there on the shelf in my videos. If you go back into my old videos, you'll see it sitting back there all the time because this is my childhood. This is what started it all for me. This is what started me on my photography journey, even though I didn't actually learn anything about photography when I was using this camera. I used it, I sold it, and I love it to this day. The Pentax K1000. That's why it's one of the most important cameras in history. Not because it helped to make me a photographer, but because there are generations of photographers who used this as their very first camera in school somewhere with some teacher trying to show them what the exposure triangle is. All right, be sure and go check out my website, check out all my gear and all the stuff that I use with my travel kit and everything else, and come back soon because there's more to come, I promise. I'll see you soon.